Hello and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dambusters, the RAF Bomber Command podcast with me, James Jeffries, and Jane Gulliford-Lowes. Today we're welcoming back and chatting to the wonderful Dr. Sarah-Louise Miller about Operation Manna and Exodus. Sarah is a historian, author and media consultant specialising in the Second World War history and is also a researcher and educator. Sarah is a lecturer at the Defence Studies Department, King's College London, and a visiting scholar in the Faculty of History, University of Oxford. Sarah is the author of 3 books, The Women Behind the Few, The Lancaster Story, which we talked to Sarah about in a previous podcast, so do check that out after listening to this one if you missed it, which is also going to be coming out in paperback in May. So paperback fans, do check that one out if you don't already have it. And in November 2024, her most recent book based on her PhD thesis was published, entitled Women in Allied Naval Intelligence in the Second World War, A Close Secret. So Sarah, welcome back to the show. It's such a pleasure for you to be back. How are you?
Oh, good. Thank you so much for having me back. It's lovely to have a chinwag with the pair of you whenever we can manage it.
Yeah, it's really nice to have you back on the show, Sarah. And of course, I've just realised as well that we're actually going to be meeting up in a couple of weeks' time, aren't we, at the International Bomber Command Centre? I've forgotten about that. Yeah, we're doing a Women in War thing. And Sarah and I are on the same panel.
International Women's Day, yeah.
Lovely. Yeah, that'd be really nice. So, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to since your last appearance on the pod and also a bit about your new book?
Of course, yes. Very busy at the Defence Studies Department. Lots of teaching and marking, which I think is better than I ever thought it could have been. I love what I do. I love working with the military and cracking on with my Hawaii book. So writing after a couple of trips out to Pearl Harbor, writing about the contributions of people in Hawaii during the Second World War has been incredibly interesting. Lots of rabbit holes I've been down, and I've also gotten into building airfix kits, which is yeah, I needed something. My dad said, find something that's going to relax. James is holding a Bristol Blenheim airfix kit up, and don't do that because now I'm going to be distracted.
Sorry.
My model. Yeah, my dad said, find something that's going to relax you. And I tried it and I found it incredibly relaxing. Apart from putting the decals on, that's not relaxing at all.
Yeah. The thing I found frustrating when I started was putting the clear canopies on and you'd use the wrong glue and it would, mist up.
Yeah.
PVA glue, everyone.
But do you put the canopy on before the paint on the pilot has dried? Conundrum.
True.
Which I can never wait, and then I end up with paint on my canopy.
Yeah. Wheels up, wheels down as well. And whether you put the pilot in, I rarely do.
I do, and then I think, well, I've missed a bit on his helmet or something. It drives me nuts. But I have been trying to make them into ATA lady pilots.
Brilliant. Love it.
See, I lack the patience for this sort of thing. I have no patience whatsoever. And literally, the whole thing would just end up being flung across the room in a fit of temper. So there we are. Anyway,
I'm not going to lie. It's nearly happened.
Yeah, and the carpet monster, when you drop an aerial on the floor and you cannot find it, it's just, we should crack on. So, Sarah, can you I know that in our last episode we talked briefly about Operation Manna and Exodus, and we'll start with Manna. Can you tell us a little bit about the events that led up to Operation Manna?
Yes, so Operation Manna appeared right at the end of the Lancaster story, and it was kind of a big turn away, a change from what I'd been writing about from the whole book to that point. So you move from bombing operations to pretty much the first airborne humanitarian relief mission in history. It's fascinating. So you've got the summer of 1944, Market Garden is launched, an airborne op to try and secure the Rhine River crossings, which would enable advance into northern Germany for the Allies. So in anticipation of that, the Dutch government in exile kind of urges railway workers in Holland to go on strike because they anticipate Market Garden's going to be a success. But as we know, that's not quite how things played out. And that meant that the German occupiers treated the Dutch who had gone on strike very harshly because they'd supported the Allies. So the transportation of food is stopped for weeks and railway rolling stock is seized and taken to Germany. And then you have a very harsh winter approaches. Rivers freeze, so you can't transport food on canals. And it's dire. So you've got 20,000 people have died already of starvation. And there's around 980,000 who are considered malnourished in the Netherlands, and they're resorting to eating their pets and tulip bulbs, things that will poison them, just in an effort to try and stay alive. It is horrendous.
So how did Operation Manna play out then, Sarah? And can you tell us a little bit about the impact that the operation had, both in the Netherlands and also on the crews who took part?
So writing about bombing, I'm sure both of you know, writing about Bomber Command can be emotionally quite taxing. And writing about Manna and Exodus, I kind of thought going into it, it will be a bit of light relief, but actually it's still pretty emotionally trying. So talking to a couple of the chaps I spoke to who were on these operations was really interesting. So it was April 1945. 242 Lancasters take off and head for the Netherlands, but they're not carrying bombs this time. They're carrying about 535 tons of food. And they designed these special kind of crates, carrier things that can drop out of the Lanc is famous for its Bombay. It's a Bombay with wings, 33-foot long Bombay, and they pack it with food on these specially designed racks that drop out. And this is the first airborne humanitarian relief mission in history. And I think the guys I spoke to who had flown on it were very aware of that. And they spoke about how it was such a lovely thing to be part of after the devastation that they knew they were causing through bombing. So they're dropping sacks that have things like sugar, dried egg powder, margarine, salt, cheese, tinned meat, flour, milk, so dried milk it would be, coffee, cereals, tea, and then chocolate that's high in vitamins because they just need to get nutrients into these people as fast as possible. So they are pretty practiced by this point in low-level flying and drops. So they're using the skills they have accumulated in Bomber Command to drop this food, and especially designated drop zones. And they actually do use the mosquitoes to mark out the drop zones so the Lancs can tell exactly where they need to drop. And I found some lovely stories of RAF aircrew who they had kind of personal rations they would take, and when they saw how desperate the people were below them, they put their rations in hankies and dropped them out with the food with little notes that said for the children. So things like sweets and chocolate. So it really got to them. You see all these Dutch people below who are just standing there with prams and wheelbarrows just waiting for this food to drop. They're so desperate. And I think that was a different kind of weight on the RAF aircrew involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned there the emotional element, which I know we've got in the script. We believe it or not, folks, we do actually have a script with our podcasts. That is something that you definitely come across a lot, the emotional blocks and such, like researching this. But yeah, Sarah, I'm a big fan of your work. I don't think it's a big secret that. A little bit more about your handling of the sort of human element and these stories. Are there any particular personal stories that you came across whilst researching that you'd like to share?
Yes, we'll get to Exodus, where there were a couple of really lovely stories I love with Exodus. But with Manna, it was more reading about the Dutch reaction. So I was sat there writing one day and I just burst into tears. And my husband was like, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And I just had to go out of the room and compose myself. And it took ages. And what it was a picture. And the picture's actually in Lancaster Story in the central pictures bit. And the Dutch had collected up all these empty bags that the food had been dropped in, and they'd spelled out on the ground, "Thank you, boys." And they'd written it in a field in sacks. And I was just flooded with tears because I thought, my word, like, it's never the thing you think is going to tip you over the edge that does. It was that. And reading about how after the war, a lot of the Dutch people maintained relationships with the RAF. So they were keen to say thank you. And a lot of the RAF guys who had been part of Manna went over annually to the Netherlands to see some of the people whose lives they had saved. And they had a really good time. But there's this one story I found. It was an American tail gunner who had been part of Chowhound, which was the American kind of version of Manna. And his American tail gunner, he meets a Dutchman who had received food that had saved his life. The American didn't speak any Dutch, the Dutchman didn't speak any English, but they knew what they were saying. The Dutchman just kept saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And the American was just crying away. He was saying, it's okay, it's okay. And it's those stories of the meetups after the war and the intense level of gratitude from the Dutch people and the RAF emotional turmoil that they had been through, bombing and then bringing life instead of death was just so incredibly emotional to read about.
I know you were thinking about doing a bit of a round table sort of about tackling the topic and such like.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you, and again, you'll both know what I mean here, when you are writing daily about Bomber Command operations, it does get to you. And when I was up at the International Bomber Command Centre, who were incredibly supportive through this research, I met with the guys that were in charge of the database of deaths and database of memorials. And the hours that they have put in, they're not paid for all of the time they put in, but I was talking to them and the three of us were just sobbing the whole way through our conversation. And one of them said to me, it's like every time you put an entry into the deaths database, it's like a pay cut and you feel it. And I said to him, I 100% know what you mean. It's like, I didn't meet any of these people. I didn't know them personally, but writing about them and often writing about their death, it's a weight and it stays with you. So I think writing about Manna and Exodus, I thought, oh, that will relieve it. But actually it's still really heavy in a different sort of way. But it does, in another way, it kind of reveals everything that's good about humanity. So bringing life and hope. And it wasn't just the food. It was the fact that people in the Netherlands saw the Lancasters and the B-17 for Manna and Chowhound, and they knew they're flying low. That means they're not in danger. That means the end of this thing is coming, the end of this conflict. So there's hope as well, and that's not something you expect.
Yeah.
It's funny what you were saying there, Sarah, about the sort of emotional toll of writing about this sort of stuff. When I was researching, not the Mindling book, but the one before that, I was focused on one particular squadron, and one of the tasks that I undertook was I basically reviewed and read every single operational record from the operational record book. So you would see a new crew arrive, and then you would see them go off on their first stop, and then you would follow them, and you'd see the same names listed week after week, and then the entry would appear, nothing further heard from this aircraft after departure. And it just stuck through you like a knife. It's just absolutely gut-wrenching. It really is. It does take a big toll, I think, when we try to tell these stories.
You almost have to mourn. I remember going to the memorial at the IBCC and I said to my husband, I just need a minute. Can you just give me a minute? And I went and stood next to the wall where all the names are. Every person in Bomber Command was killed on operations. I just went and stood there and just took a moment and thought, I just need to, in a way, mourn all the people I've written about. And I found some of the names on there that I'd written about. Finley McRae haunts me. So that's a 19-year-old who was killed on bomber ops. His family were in touch with me while I was writing the book. And I found his name and just stood there and touched it for a minute. And it's your way of kind of coming to terms with what you've had to write.
I think it's the families actually that hit me the most, and especially when you're researching someone. So with the Augsburg book, obviously you've got the bigger figures, the key figures, Sherwood, Nettleton, etc., etc. But I wanted to know about, the air gunner, a 44 squadron that shot down and is just a figure. And I dive into it and you find, I can't think of the word, but, what's written on the headstone, and you find out there's a local memorial in New Zealand or something. And it's just, that's what hits me. I just go, gosh, some of these messages you get as well. And also talking to relatives afterwards, you just realise how the ripples resonate so much. And they're still going, they're still touching people. I mean, we only need to go back a couple of weeks, don't we, Jane, with Andrew's letter. I know we mentioned it in the last pod, how incredibly powerful this stuff is, and the relative attachment. And I have to have breaks. I have to go and read Great Expectations by Charles Dickens or something. Because I'm still a history nerd, but it's just so away from it. That's what don't spoil the ending because I haven't actually finished it yet. But you have to do that, don't you?
You absolutely do. You're much better than me. I'll just turn some rubbish TV on, viewing out from here. You're keeping it sensible there. But I completely
It's football agree. Sometimes, I will say. But that's not so good on the emotion sometimes, I will say.
Well, fair enough. Yeah, plenty of sport.
When I was researching the mine laying book and looking into a particular cruise, one of the things I did was go to the National Archives, and I read all the casualty files and the correspondence from the families. It's absolutely heartbreaking. It really is. Just, from mums who are still writing in 1945, their son went missing in 1941 and they're still asking if there's any news. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking. It really is. But this is what we do, and this is why we do it, I guess, ultimately, isn't it?
It's true. It's true. Yeah. I think some of the reactions to the Lancaster story were people who had expected it to be more about the aircraft and wanted more on the metal that makes it up and, every rivet that's in it. And while I, to some extent, understand that, for me, like having read these stories and had these family members contact me, it was just so important that they took front and center stage in the book, because like when I did a taxi ride on Just Jane at the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre, so it's a Lancaster you can fully recommend that taxi in, and I was just sobbing the whole time, and the safety officer said to me, without those boys this was just a heap of metal. And that is absolutely true. And you're right, Jane, it's the people. It's not even just the people that go down with the aircraft, it's their families. It's the people that feel it for decades after that. And it's really important to capture that.
Yeah, that's why I really like the book. There are tons of technical things out there. You want to know how many rivets are on the wing of a Lancaster? They're out there. But the personal stories and from the multiple perspectives, which is a brilliant book. I love it, and I am there for that nerdy stuff. But I do love that personal element that you bring in. And of course, we should mention, you've mentioned earlier, the ground perspective, and also those that were underneath the bombs. That incredibly heartbreaking when you start researching that side, as well as who was in the bombers and who was on the ground, the engineers and the WAFs, et cetera, et cetera. It's just endless, isn't it, really?
It gets very big, very fast.
So now I think we'd probably move on to Exodus. So can you tell us a little about what this was and how that came about?
Yes, Exodus is another task that's given to bombers at the end of the war that doesn't involve bombs. So it's bringing home Allied prisoners of war who have been interned in German-occupied areas of Europe. So it's people who have bailed out. So there were actually members of Lancaster crews who had to bail out over enemy territory. So prisoners of war who have been interned in camps and need to get home once they are liberated at the end of the war. So it's April to May 1945. There's over 350,000 ex-POWs that need to be brought home. And many of them are, as you can imagine, in pretty bad shape. So some of them have spent years interned in German camps. They're exhausted. Many of them are poorly. They're injured. They're emaciated. I found multiple cases where people weighed half what they did when they went in. So, they're in bad shape. They need food, they need medicine, and they need to be brought home. Obviously, not all of them. Some of them haven't been there very long at all. But it's hard for the RAF air crews to see people in that state. So they convert the Lancaster is incredibly adaptable. And I know I'm talking to two people here who are not, massive fans of the Lanc in the same way that I am. I know this. And I'm a big fan of Halifaxes and Blenheims and all sorts of other aircraft too. But something about the Lanc I repeatedly found was it's so adaptable. So they adapt that massive bomb bay to carry 24 ex-POWs as well as the crew. So that's what they do. They are flying multiple times a day, bringing as many people home as they can get into the aircraft. So they're brought to specially designated airfields like Lübeck in Germany, for example, and they're brought back to their home.
So what sort of numbers are we talking about then, Sarah, in terms of the men brought back?
In total, so they were bringing over 1,000 per day.
Gosh.
In total, they got about 75,000 people home. And it wasn't a case of bring them home and wham, they're done. They had to be kind of rehabilitated, because if you've spent years in a camp, you don't know what's happened in the outside world. So they had to actually go through medical treatment. A lot of them, they had to learn how to eat again. Obviously, when your stomach is shrunk, you cannot just gorge yourself on food. They had to learn how to eat and drink properly again, and they had to be taught about what life was like now that they were home, what's changed, what's happened in your absence. It wasn't a case of just run through your front door and hug your parents, which a lot of the time was what they really wanted to do. It's pretty tricky because they've got this huge amount of excitement that's bubbled up in them because they're coming home, but then they're not quite home yet when they get back to Britain.
And it will be a different Britain as well, especially if you were shot down in September 39 and taken prisoner. And so much more to adapt to as well.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, I think the thing that got to me again here was the reactions of the people involved. So a guy, this was a really touching one for me because I got to go back to the village that my family has been from for about 300 years because I did my ancestry in lockdown. Pretty boring. They didn't go anywhere for about 300 years. RAF Methwold. So it's a little village in Norfolk. And 149 Squadron was based there at Bomber Command. And so they had like a village memory collection where someone thought to get some oral histories, and which was fantastic. And
Brilliant.
I'm so glad they did. A guy called Jeff, who served with 149, he was Royal Australian Air Force. So he's come as far around the world as you can to serve. He completed 32 wartime missions as 149, and then he is part of Exodus. And he says, it's super moving. You can see their thin, starved faces, and they're relieved, but they also don't quite believe that they're coming home, and they're just in a really bad way. And he didn't ever forget that. And he said the crew routinely would leave their parachutes at home for these missions because they couldn't put them in for all the chaps they were bringing home. And they said, if we're going down together.
Gosh. Wow. That's quite something.
Hard hitting.
Is there any other personal stories, Sarah, you'd like to share with us with regard to Exodus?
Yeah, there's a couple. I shared one at We Have Ways. I'm not sure I didn't share it in the last time I chatted with you both, but there's another one that I think is fascinating. I got to go and meet a guy called Al Lovett, who is this absolutely brilliant. He's just celebrated his 101st birthday in Birmingham. So he was a bomb aimer, and he went on Manna and Exodus. So he said that on Exodus, he was approached by a 21-year-old flight sergeant who asked if he could spend the trip home in the rear turret of the Lancaster rather than in the main fuselage. And Al said, "Why do you want to do that? You've been in a camp for a while now. Why don't you take it easy and I'll squish myself into the turret?" And he said it was the position that he'd actually been occupying in his own Lancaster when he'd been shot down. So this is the 24th of March. He had, in 1944, he jumped out of the rear turret at 18,000 feet without a parachute because his own parachute had been burned. The flames had pretty much, he thought, I'll jump for it rather than burn to death in the rear turret. So he's 18,000 feet up, jumps out without a parachute and lands on a snowy mountain. So dense forest and snow, landed in a snowdrift, which is the only reason he didn't die. It's found by a German patrol, taken to a hospital, has a broken ankle and he's pretty beaten up, but he's alive. And so Al doesn't really believe this, but it turns out when he speaks to some other people, it is true. And the chap says, "I want to sit in the rear turret because I want to recover my nerve. I don't want to go home and still feel afraid." So he says, "Yeah, sure, okay, sit in the rear turret." And he does. He sits in the rear turret all the way home after this horrible experience. And I just thought that was fascinating, Al's conversation with him and what he went through, and still wanting to go home and not feel afraid. He does not want that to rule him and own him for the rest of his life.
I hope he managed to get some sort of closure from doing that then. God, what an experience. How do you ever get off anything like that happening to you? It's just... And then to spend, to go through that and then to end up being a POW as well. It's just...
Yeah.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? God.
It was interesting talking to people like Al who, there was so much they didn't want to talk about, which I think we find commonly, don't we, with Bomber Command. There's a lot that they don't want to talk about. But with Al, I spoke to Al a lot. His memory is incredible. And Manna and Exodus were things he really did want to talk about because he knew that in a way it kind of not made up for being part of bombing raids, but it was his healing.
Yes.
That was how he described it. It was sort of healing for him to be able to do something that he knew was going to bring life and save life and bring people home after what they had to do through the rest of the war. And I found he kind of lit up when we were talking about Manna and Exodus.
I'd like to introduce it at this stage a similar sort of operation, but one which happens much later in 1945. And this is, I believe, called Operation Sketch. I wrote about it briefly in the book. And this is involving operations to bring home men from the Far East, so from India, Burma, etc. But obviously much later, 1945. And I was quite interested to see which aircraft were being used for this operation. I think it was basically whatever was left and whatever was still serviceable, because 3 members of my uncle's crew ended up in the transport squadrons, and this is what they were doing throughout sort of 45, particularly the back end of 45, not long before they were demobbed actually, was bringing people back from the Far East and back from India. So they were actually flying short Stirlings, would you believe? I mean, how old are short Stirlings at this point? Yeah, which had been adapted to bring, basically thousands of British servicemen back home from India, and also taking Commonwealth servicemen back home from the UK back to their countries of origin as well. So it was a two-way trip. So this undertaking is codenamed Operation Sketch, I believe. So this involves flying these ancient Stirlings with their insides ripped out to accommodate a 5-man crew. Obviously, you don't need gunners anymore. 24 passengers, same as the Lancaster, with kit. So they would fly from Suffolk to Melsbrook in Belgium, which I believe was a former Luftwaffe base. Then across the Mediterranean to Castel Benito in Libya. There the crews would change over before flying onto Shalufa in Egypt, then to Lida in Palestine, then to Maripur on the outskirts of Karachi, and finally to Arakonam in Tamil Nadu in the far south of India. What a journey that was. Can you imagine doing that in a Stirling? Yeah. Absolutely incredible.
That is an incredible distance.
Yeah.
So thousands of these trips are made backwards and forth along this very tortuous route by 158 and other transport squadrons. Interestingly, the skipper of my uncle's crew and George Phillipson, the flight engineer, actually flew more hours after the war with 158 Squadron to India than had actually flown operationally during their operational tour at RAF Melbourne. So I'll just read this little story in connection with Operation Sketch. There was no cloud and visibility was good as the aircraft, piloted by 158 Squadron's Flight Lieutenant Wilson, sped down the electrical lit runway. The Stirling appeared to be in trouble almost immediately and struggled to gain height. Just a minute after takeoff and from an altitude of only 200 feet, it was seen to hit the ground a short distance from the end of the runway and burst into flames. Except for 1 passenger, all were killed or died shortly afterwards. The cause of the crash was never established, but all short Stirlings were removed from troop transports with effect in the end of December 1945. And poor George Phillipson never did get back home to Upton Park in London. And he's buried in the Commonwealth War Cemetery in Tripoli in Libya. So even right up to the end of 1945, people are still losing their lives flying these bombers. It's such a sad story and such a sad ending as well for the men who managed to survive the war, and get through their tours, to have this happen to them, and for those poor soldiers coming back from the Far East as well. It's absolutely heartbreaking. But again, that's something which people don't really talk about, that side of things. It's all sort of, it ends in May 40, later on if you're in the Pacific Theatre. But yeah, there's all these other bits and pieces still going on. I think we forget that just because that the surrender takes place, the aftermath continues and the ripples are felt for a very long time afterwards. A very long time.
Absolutely, yeah. I found certain instances where Lancasters and other aircraft were being used to do all sorts of things after the conflict had officially concluded. Even things like mapping. So they'd realised through the war how inaccurate a lot of the maps were, and they were doing kind of reconnaissance flying to map out areas of Europe that they needed better coverage of. It didn't all just finish You're absolutely right there, Jane.
Yeah. I think as well, you have to bear in mind that Britain was absolutely broke at the end of the war. So, there's not the money to invest in new technology immediately. You've basically got to use whatever's on hand to complete these tasks. And some of these aircraft, are absolutely ancient and dropping to bits. But here we are. Anyway.
Yeah, we need to do something on the short Stirling. Actually, I think we've got that in the notes because it's an interesting aircraft. I can't say I'm a massive fan. I'm probably going to get loads of people saying, "Oh, you can't say that." But yeah, it's got a very interesting story, and they've got the Stirling project as well. That would be good to, if someone's listening attached to that, it'd be really good to have you on to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. It's an absolute beast, the Stirling, as well, isn't it? It's absolutely massive. It's huge.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not got the finesse that
it hasn't.
The Lanca's got.
No, it's got no finesse whatsoever. But anyway.
So apart from obviously more airfix kits, I imagine, what else are you up to? What are the next projects that you're up to, Sarah?
Yeah, so I've got my Wildcat airfix that I had some setbacks there because a cat stole a piece of the undercarriage, which is notoriously difficult on that one. And I also had I'm very embarrassed to say this in a podcast that people are going to listen to, but I actually stuck a wing on upside down as well. So I had my first experience with using a scalpel to surgically remove a piece that I had glued on and had to then put on the right way up. But it is incredibly satisfying when you actually manage to correct a mistake. So yeah, it's all sorts of shenanigans with the Wildcat, but we're getting there. But other than that, just cracking on with the Hawaii book, which is due to the publisher in December. So should be out next year. And that is fascinating. So I'm properly bogged down in the Pacific War at the moment, which is great because I teach a lot on the Pacific at the Defence Academy. So that's been really enjoyable, kind of pivoting from the European theatre to more what was happening in the Pacific, and specifically looking at the contributions of people in the Pacific. Because I think when we think about the Pacific, it's quite tempting to think, Americans, British, Australians, New Zealanders, but actually I'm looking at a lot of Southeast Asian people's experiences and Hawaiian Islanders.
Brilliant.
Pacific and Polynesian Islanders, Japanese, so Nisei contributions. And so that's been really interesting because I think we do forget certain perspectives. And one of the things I enjoy the most is recovering the voices that we don't tend to always hear. So that has been fascinating. And I think, the story Jane shared about Sketch, it's really important to remember that this was a global conflict and that things were happening all over the world rather than just the bit that we happen to be really interested in. That's been really interesting, really rewarding thing to do. And obviously, what a schlep out to Hawaii. Poor me, having to go out to Hawaii.
Yeah, how awful for you.
Yeah.
So how did you get sort of interested in that particular topic and how did the book arise?
It was funny, actually. It was a rabbit hole I went down when I did my PhD. So I was looking at women in Allied naval intelligence, and I didn't want to just look at the Battle of the Atlantic. I wanted to look at the Pacific Naval War. So obviously, intelligence was crucial at Midway, Coral Sea. And I discovered the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean area, which was in Hawaii. Joe Rochefort, famous code breaker out there. And I I wanted to get some stuff out there that would be in my PhD, but when I got out there, I found so much that I thought I cannot shoehorn this in. It needs a project of its own. So I ended up kind of leaving that part out of the PhD. I just covered Midway and Coral Sea, but I then saved a lot of what I found for this separate book, and I took it to a publisher and they snapped it up because it is a bit of a gap. There aren't many of those left anymore. It can be tricky to find one, but this was really important to me to do from a local perspective. So I spent a lot of time talking to Hawaiian Islanders and Southeast Asian people who had relatives that fought in the Pacific Theatre and people who lived in Hawaii. And it was just fascinating. It's a perspective you cannot get unless you go that far. And it was an absolute joy getting to know the people of Hawaii and the character of the islands. It's a very, very special place.
Oh, I'd love to go there. You're so lucky. You really are. What a fantastic
And the Pearl Harbor
concept.
Aviation Museum, fully recommend that as well. They've got the B-17 Swamp Ghost.
Cool. Yeah.
Wow. What an experience. That sounds just amazing, doesn't it? I think I might have to write a book that involves going somewhere more exotic than the North Sea or the Heligoland Bight. But although I'm not doing too bad with my Norway explorations, and that's the next book for me. So not that I've written much of it lately, but yeah, I did get a trip to the Lofoten Islands out of it, so I can't complain.
Lovely.
Yeah, most gorgeous place I've ever been, but cold.
Oh, very jealous.
Yeah, lovely. Right, I think we'll wrap things up there, Jay. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, nothing from me.
Well, thank you, Sarah, so much. That was absolutely fantastic. We'll add details of Sarah's social media details in the show notes so you can follow her and follow her work. I'm afraid, though, it's time to bring things to an end for this episode. If you don't already do so, please give us a follow on our social media. The links are in the pod description, as well as links to our Facebook group, which has regular discussions. And don't forget to leave us a review or rating wherever you get your podcasts. It really does make a massive difference to us and helps other people to find us too. Please hit the subscribe button again in the show notes, and you can do so from just £2.60 a month. And it's your support that keeps this pod going. So a massive thank you to our current monthly subscribers, and do consider signing up if you haven't already. Until next time, I'll see you all later. Thank you. Bye.